At my mother's 73rd birthday, my daughter pulled out a chair beside her cousin's. My brother Colin caught the back of it before Nora could sit. He dragged it 2 feet away from the table, the legs scraping across the hardwood loud enough to silence the whole room. "Our children don't sit with a convicted man's daughter," he said. Nora froze with one hand still resting on the chair. She was 17, but in that moment she looked 6 again, standing outside the courthouse while reporters shouted her father's name. I waited for my mother to correct him. Instead, she leaned close and whispered, "Don't make this harder for everyone." So I took my daughter's coat, walked her out, and left without arguing. 3 weeks later, Nora placed an old mini DV tape on our kitchen table. "I found this in the camera Dad gave me when I was 6, she said. "The family DVD is missing 14 minutes. The tape had started long before the storm warning. At 7:40 p.m., a glass cabinet reflected Colin slipping Aaron's red leather key fob, maintenance badge, and work jacket from the coat rack. Then he walked out the side door. At 8:18 p.m., a tornado warning crawled across the television. The exact minute hospital records claimed Aaron's badge opened a service corridor 24 minutes away. But Aaron was still in my mother's living room. He never left the frame. Nearly half an hour later, Colin came back through the rear door, with Aaron's jacket folded under his arm. One sleeve was torn. My mother glanced toward the hallway and whispered, "Put it back before Monica notices." My phone rang before I could breathe. Colin's name appeared on the screen. I answered on speaker. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then my brother said 7 words that changed everything. "Please don't give that video to the police." That was when I understood. Colin had not humiliated my daughter because he believed her father was guilty. He had humiliated her because he needed us to keep believing it. Before I tell you how 14 missing minutes exposed an 11-year lie, let me know where you are listening from. Stay with me to the end, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about families, secrets, and the truth that refuses to stay buried. 3 weeks earlier, I was still convincing myself that a few uncomfortable hours at my mother's house were a small price to pay for keeping Nora connected to her family. Evelyn Hale had lived in the same 2-story house for 38 years. Every birthday, Thanksgiving, graduation, and funeral meal seemed to happen beneath its cream-colored ceilings. As a child, I had believed the house made us close. At 49, I understood that it merely gave my mother a place where everyone knew the rules. That afternoon, the dining room was decorated with white roses and gold paper numbers announcing her 73rd birthday. Colin had arranged everything. He had hired the caterer, ordered the cake, and invited several people from the recovery program he ran. Every few minutes, someone praised him. They thanked him for helping a husband get sober or finding a treatment bed for someone's daughter. Colin accepted each compliment with the same practiced humility, one hand resting over his heart as if he were surprised the community considered him a good man. My daughter remained near the edge of the room. Nora was 17, tall and slender, with Aaron's dark eyes and my habit of folding inward when a room felt unsafe. She offered to collect empty glasses. She helped my mother carry napkins. When the family gathered around Evelyn for photographs, Nora stepped back before anyone could ask her to move. I noticed all of it. I also pretended not to. For 11 years, I had told myself that ignoring small cruelties kept them from becoming larger ones. If I did not react when someone stopped talking after Nora entered, the conversation might recover. If I did not challenge the absence of her photograph from my mother's mantel, perhaps the next family picture would include her. Silence had become the tool I used to preserve things that were already broken. Aaron's conviction followed Nora everywhere. Though she had been only 6 when he was arrested, he had worked as a maintenance supervisor at the county hospital before controlled medication was found in his work vehicle. His badge had opened a service corridor near the drug storage area, and a security camera showed someone wearing his maintenance jacket. Aaron said the evidence had been planted. My family said guilty men always blamed someone else. I had spent 11 years standing between those two statements without fully choosing either one. When dinner was announced, Colin's children and the other cousins rushed toward the long table. My mother had placed name cards beside nearly every plate. There was one for each grandchild, except Nora. I saw her notice. Her expression did not change. She had become skilled at receiving rejection without giving the person who caused it the satisfaction of seeing pain. "There's an extra chair by the wall," I said. I picked it up before my mother could object and placed it near the end of the table. Nora thanked me quietly, though she should never have needed to thank her mother for finding her a place in her own family. She carried the chair toward the open space beside her cousins. Colin moved faster than I expected. He caught the wooden back, pulled it from her hand, and scraped it across the floor. The sound cut through the room and stopped every conversation. Then he said what I had heard in the hook, with his children watching and my mother close enough to touch his shoulder. No one defended Nora. One of my aunts lowered her eyes to her plate. Colin's oldest son looked embarrassed, but he stayed in his seat. Someone near the kitchen pretended to rearrange silverware. I looked at my mother, waiting for the smallest sign that there was still a line Colin was not allowed to cross. Evelyn stepped toward me, not toward him. Her voice was soft enough to sound reasonable. "Don't make this harder for everyone." Something inside me shifted. Not dramatically. There was no sudden courage. No perfect response waiting in my mouth. I simply understood that my mother believed the problem was not Colin's cruelty. The problem was that Nora and I might force everyone else to acknowledge it. I reached for my daughter's coat. "Mom, it's fine," Nora whispered. It was the sentence that made my decision for me. My child had been publicly rejected, and her first instinct was to protect me from the inconvenience of defending her. "No," I said quietly. "It isn't." I helped her into her coat, took my own from the rack, and walked toward the front door. Colin did not apologize. My mother followed us only far enough to make sure the other guests could hear her. "Monica, leaving will only prove you came here looking for a scene." I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. For years, I had wanted my mother to understand me. That evening, I realized understanding had never been the issue. She understood exactly what Colin had done. She simply preferred that Nora absorb the damage quietly. "I'm not making a scene," I told her. "I'm taking my daughter home." The cold air outside struck my face as soon as I opened the door. Nora walked to the car without looking back. For the first 10 minutes of the drive, neither of us spoke. The streetlights passed across her face, briefly illuminating her eyes before leaving them in shadow again. Finally, she asked, "Did Dad really do it?" My hands tightened around the steering wheel. I could have repeated the official answer. Aaron had accepted a plea agreement. He had served nearly 4 years. The hospital records, the badge, the jacket, and the medication in his vehicle had all pointed in the same direction. But that was not what Nora had asked. "I don't know," I admitted. She turned toward the window. "You always say that." "I wasn't there when it happened. You were at Grandma's birthday." The words struck a place I had worked hard not to touch. I had been at that house on the night Aaron was accused. I remembered a storm warning, frightened children, raised voices, and Aaron leaving angry. The details had blurred until I no longer knew which memories were mine and which had been repeated to me afterward. Nora wiped the corner of one eye before I could pretend not to notice. "Why do we keep going back there?" she asked. "Why do we keep visiting people who treat me like I'm evidence against someone?" I had no answer that would not expose my cowardice. I had wanted Nora to have grandparents, cousins, birthday invitations, and holiday dinners. I had mistaken access for love and endurance for belonging. When we reached home, she went straight to her room. I sat in the kitchen with my coat still on, hearing the chair scrape across my mother's floor again and again. Near midnight, Nora came downstairs carrying her laptop. An unfinished scholarship application filled the screen. The name at the top read Nora Shaw. "My counselor said I could use Hale," she said. "It might be easier if they search my name." I knew what she meant. Aaron's conviction was still easy to find online. You can use whichever name you want. I want mine. There was no anger in her voice. That made the statement stronger. She closed the laptop and looked toward the basement door. Do you still have anything of Dad's? The question made my chest tighten. A few boxes. Some tools, letters, old photographs. I never sorted all of it. I want to see them. We went downstairs together. The basement smelled of dust, cardboard, and fabric starch from the supplies I stored for my alteration shop. Nora searched the shelves while I moved boxes labeled with years I had spent avoiding. At the bottom of a plastic container filled with childhood toys, she found a small silver camcorder. Dust clouded the screen, and one corner was covered with a faded sticker of a blue butterfly. Nora turned it over in her hands. I remember this, she said. Dad gave it to me because he bought a newer one. She opened the side compartment. A mini DV tape was still inside. Across the label, written in the uneven purple letters of a 6-year-old, were 4 words. Grandma's birthday, my camera. Nora carried the camcorder upstairs, as carefully as if it contained something alive. At the kitchen table, she wiped the dust from its silver casing with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. The blue butterfly sticker had faded almost white, but its uneven edges still carried the marks of her 6-year-old fingers. I need a media preservation project for class, she said. Her eyes stayed on the camera rather than on me. I knew the assignment was only part of the reason. She had gone downstairs asking for something that belonged to Aaron. What she wanted was proof that he had once existed outside court records, newspaper photographs, and the warnings my family attached to his name. Do you remember using it? I asked. Pieces of it. She turned the camera over and examined the ports. Dad let me have it, after he bought a newer one. I mostly filmed the floor. A reluctant smile touched my mouth. You filmed your shoes a lot. Maybe my shoes know something. The joke was light, but neither of us laughed for long. The battery had swollen with age, and the charger was missing. Nora searched online for the model number, then explained that we would need a mini DV deck or an old camera with a working FireWire connection to transfer the tape without damaging it. She did not speak like a forensic expert. She spoke like a student who had used school equipment and watched several tutorials. Every few minutes, she stopped to admit what she did not know. That date on the label might not mean the camera date is accurate, she warned me. People could reset these clocks. Batteries died. Settings got lost. I appreciated her caution, though it also frightened me. Hope was easier when it was vague. Once we began testing it, we might discover there was nothing inside the tape except blurred walls and a child's forgotten birthday. I found the official family DVD in a cabinet above the refrigerator. My mother had given copies to everyone years ago, long before I understood why she considered certain memories worth preserving and others better left unmentioned. The disc was labeled in Evelyn's careful handwriting. Her 62nd birthday, April 2015. Nora loaded it into my laptop. The video began with white tablecloths, grocery store flowers, and my mother pretending she did not like being filmed. Colin appeared carrying a tray of drinks. I moved through the background with my hair pulled into a loose knot, looking younger and more tired than I remembered. Then Aaron entered the frame. My breath caught before I could stop it. He wore the dark green shirt I had bought him the Christmas before. His hair was still thick and black at the temples. He leaned down to say something to 6-year-old Nora, who immediately covered her mouth and laughed. The sound was muted beneath music someone had added during the DVD conversion. Nora moved closer to the screen. That's the first time I've seen him moving, she said. I looked at her. You've seen other videos. Not since I was little. The difference mattered. Photographs had allowed my family to reduce Aaron to a face. Movement restored his habits. The way he rolled one shoulder when his back hurt. The way he checked whether Nora's cup was too close to the edge of the table. The way he looked across the room for me after someone made him laugh. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. The official video showed dinner, cake preparations, and a few crowded conversations. Aaron remained near the living room doorway until a scene in which he and Colin appeared to exchange tense words. The picture then jumped. One moment, the television in the background showed a basketball game. The next, several relatives were returning from the basement, while a weather banner disappeared from the screen. Aaron was gone. I paused the DVD. "What happened between those shots?" Nora asked. "The storm warning. Was it bad?" "There was a tornado watch most of the afternoon. Later, the sirens went off, and your grandmother made everyone move downstairs." "Did Dad go with us?" My mouth went dry. "I don't remember." It was an honest answer, but it sounded weak even to me. I remembered carrying Nora down the basement steps. I remembered her crying because she hated the sirens. I remembered my stepfather struggling to move quickly because of his bad knee. Around those fragments sat other memories that had been repeated so often I could no longer tell whether I had witnessed them. Aaron had become angry. Aaron had left. Aaron had come back later. Those sentences belonged to my mother's voice, Colin's voice, and eventually my own. Nora checked the DVD's progress bar, then rewound to the jump. 14 minutes, she said. "What?" "The video skips forward 14 minutes. I stared at the number. Maybe whoever made the DVD removed the storm warning because nothing happened. Maybe. She did not accuse anyone. Her restraint made the silence heavier. The next afternoon, she borrowed an older transfer unit from her school's media lab with her teacher's permission. We set it up on the same kitchen table where she had once done spelling homework while I waited for Aaron's collect calls from jail. Nora inserted the mini DV tape and began the transfer. The picture appeared in small blocks of color before resolving into a low, crooked view of my mother's living room. The audio hissed. Half the frame was occupied by the edge of a bookshelf. A child's hand covered the lens. Then Aaron's voice came through, warmer and nearer than it had sounded in my memory. "Keep your fingers down here, sweetheart. Otherwise, every movie is going to star your thumb." 6-year-old Nora giggled. The camera tilted wildly until Aaron's face appeared from below. "You've got 45 minutes on that tape," he said. "Use them wisely." "Can I film Grandma opening presents?" "You can film whatever you want, as long as you don't drop it in the cake." Present-day Nora stopped the transfer. Her hand remained on the keyboard. "He gave it to me that night." I nodded, though I could not speak. She restarted the tape. For the next several minutes, we watched the party from 6-year-old Nora's height. Shoes crossed the frame. Adults leaned down and asked whether she was making a movie. She recorded the lower half of the dining table, the family dog begging for food, and a long argument between two cousins about frosting. At approximately 7:35, the camera settled on a shelf. Young Nora could be heard asking someone when the cake would be served. Her footsteps moved away, but the camera continued recording. The angle was imperfect, but wider than the official video. It captured most of the living room, part of the hallway, the coat rack, and the glass doors of my mother's china cabinet. "Did I forget it?" Nora asked. "You must have." She checked the transfer line. It never stopped. We watched quietly. Aaron crossed the room several times. Colin appeared near the coat rack, though his body was partly hidden by the hallway wall. In the glass cabinet, a dark reflection moved toward the hanging coats. Nora leaned closer, but the reflected image was too small to identify what he was doing. "Can you enlarge that?" I asked. "I can, but it'll lose detail. I don't want to invent something because we expect to see it." She marked the time without making a conclusion. Soon after, Colin disappeared from the room. No one commented on it. The party continued, and the camera recorded ordinary fragments that had once seemed too insignificant to remember. Aaron helped my stepfather lower himself into his chair. He moved Nora's glass away from the table edge. He crouched to straighten the loose leg of the camera shelf when the picture began to tilt. The basketball game vanished from the television. A weather map filled the screen. An alert tone sounded. Every muscle in my back tightened. The message scrolled across the bottom of the television. warning residents to move to a lower floor and stay away from windows. Voices rose. Children began asking questions. My mother directed everyone toward the basement. Nora paused the image and turned on the camera's data display. The number in the corner read 8:12 p.m. That clock could still be wrong, she reminded me. I nodded toward the television. The warning wasn't recorded. It was live. If the station archived it, we could check the actual time. The tape continued. I saw myself carrying 6-year-old Nora toward the basement door, one of her arms locked around my neck. Several relatives followed us. Aaron did not. He remained in the living room with my stepfather, helping him stand. When the older man could not manage the basement stairs, Aaron settled him into the strongest chair, closed the curtains, and moved both of them away from the windows. The time display advanced. 8:14 8:16 At 8:18, the weather warning still moved across the television. Aaron remained in the frame. He knelt in front of the little girl I had been carrying moments earlier, after I apparently brought her back upstairs for her shoes. He tied the lace that had come undone, then looked toward me, and said something the camcorder barely caught. "She'll trip if we have to move fast." I stopped breathing. The hospital was 24 minutes from my mother's house on a clear night. The police report had said Aaron's maintenance badge opened the service corridor at 8:18. For 11 years, those numbers had lived in separate parts of my mind. One belonged to a hospital file. The other belonged to a family evening I had allowed other people to remember for me. Now, they occupied the same screen. Nora moved the video forward, one frame at a time. Aaron's hands tightened the bow on her small white sneaker. Behind him, the tornado warning continued crawling across the television. She looked from the screen to me, her face pale and completely still. Mom, Dad was here. For several seconds, I could only stare at the frozen image of Aaron tying Nora's shoe. The television behind him showed a red weather map, and the time display on the camcorder read 8:18 p.m. That was the same minute his maintenance badge had opened a service corridor at the hospital. I had repeated that fact so many times over the years that it had hardened into something larger than evidence. It had become part of how I understood my husband. Now I was looking at him 24 minutes away from the hospital, kneeling beside our daughter without ever leaving the camera's view. Nora opened the local television station's digital archive. The website had preserved weather bulletins from major storms, including the tornado warning from that night. She found the broadcast schedule and compared it with the television visible in her video. The alert began at 8:12 and ended at 8:26, exactly as the recording showed. The presenter's gestures, the counties highlighted on the map, and even a brief interruption in the audio matched frame for frame. Whatever time had been set on the camcorder, the television gave us an independent clock. I entered my mother's address and the hospital into an online map. The fastest route was 24 minutes in normal traffic, and the storm would not have made it faster. Aaron could not have left the living room after 8:12, reached the hospital by 8:18, used his badge, and returned before the warning ended. We did not need to calculate a round trip or prove where anyone else had been during those 14 minutes. The video established one simple physical fact. Aaron could not have been the person using his badge at the hospital because he was standing in my mother's house when it happened. Nora pushed her chair back and began pacing beside the kitchen table. "We need to send this to the police," she said. "Right now, before anyone can say we made it up." She reached for her phone, but I placed my hand over it. The last thing I wanted was to silence her again. Yet posting a compressed clip online could give Colin exactly what he needed. People would argue about editing, the camera clock, and why the video had appeared after 11 years. The original tape mattered more than the excitement of exposing a single frame. "We don't know how evidence is supposed to be handled," I told her. "If this can help your father, we do it carefully." Nora pulled her hand away, and for a moment, I saw the familiar resentment in her face. Adults had used caution as another word for cowardice throughout her childhood. I understood why she did not trust mine. I promised we would not hide the tape, delay for my mother's comfort, or ask Colin for permission. We would watch everything first, preserve the original, and then find someone who knew how to reopen a wrongful conviction case. Nora returned to the beginning of the recording. This time, we did not skip toward the storm warning. We watched every awkward angle and ordinary conversation from the moment her 6-year-old self placed the camcorder on the shelf. At 7:39, Colin crossed the hallway and stopped near the coat rack. His body was partly hidden, but the china cabinet opposite him reflected the movement of his hands. Nora enlarged the image just enough to see a small red shape hanging between his fingers. She covered her mouth. "That's Dad's keychain." I looked closer and recognized the worn strip of red leather, unevenly punched with 3 crooked stars. Nora had made it during a first-grade craft lesson. Aaron had carried it even after the leather began splitting around the metal ring, because he told her handmade things deserved to be used, not protected in drawers. In the reflection, Colin removed the keys from Aaron's coat pocket. He then reached deeper into the coat and pulled out a rectangular badge attached to a retractable clip. The image softened whenever Nora enlarged it, but the sequence remained clear. Colin looked toward the dining room, removed Aaron's dark maintenance jacket from the rack, folded it over one arm, and walked through the side door. The data display read 7:40. He had left more than half an hour before Aaron's badge opened the hospital corridor. No one in the room appeared to notice, because cake plates were being arranged, and my mother was calling people into the dining room for photographs. We continued through the tornado warning. Aaron stayed visible throughout the full 14 minutes. He helped my stepfather move away from the windows, steadied a lamp when the wind rattled the house, and tightened the laces on Nora's sneakers. At one point, he looked directly toward the television and repeated the name of a nearby county. His reaction matched the broadcast as it happened. This was not an old clip placed beside a later timestamp. It was one continuous moment unfolding in real time. The recording became uneventful again after 8:26. Some relatives returned from the basement. My younger self carried blankets upstairs and complained that the storm had ruined the cake candles. Aaron remained in the living room, irritated but present. Then, around 8:47, the rear door opened. Colin entered from the kitchen passage, with Aaron's jacket folded under his arm. The right sleeve had a fresh tear near the cuff, and a pale line of fabric showed through the dark material. My mother appeared at the edge of the hallway. She looked toward the basement stairs, then toward me in the dining room. The camcorder's microphone caught her voice beneath the conversations around her. "Put it back before Monica notices." Colin returned the jacket to the rack. His hand moved near the pocket, and a moment later the red keychain briefly caught the light before disappearing inside. Nora paused the video. She knew. I could not answer with certainty about what my mother knew, but I could no longer pretend she had seen nothing. She had watched Colin return property that belonged to Aaron and told him to replace it before I noticed. 11 years later, she had watched Colin move Nora's chair away from the family table and asked me not to make things harder. The two moments no longer felt separate. We kept watching because I needed to know whether every memory of that night had been false. Near 8:55, Colin approached Aaron and said something about the hospital finally discovering who had been causing trouble. Aaron's shoulders stiffened. Colin smiled and made another remark too low for the camcorder to capture. Aaron shoved his chair back, told me he needed air, and left through the front door in anger. That part was real. Aaron had left the party furious, exactly as my family had always said. But he had left at 8:55, 37 minutes after his badge was used at the hospital. Someone had taken a genuine event and moved it backward until it fit the crime. My stomach clenched so violently that I had to lower my head between my knees. I remembered Aaron walking out. I remembered Colin saying he had been gone earlier. I remembered my mother repeating the same sequence until the hour attached itself to the wrong moment. "This wasn't just people forgetting," Nora said. Her voice had lost its urgency and become frighteningly calm. Someone built the story around what really happened later. I looked again at Colin, taking the keys, the badge, and the jacket. His words at the birthday table returned to me. Our children don't sit with a convicted man's daughter. Until that moment, I had heard only contempt in the sentence. Now I heard fear. Keeping Nora ashamed of her father had also kept her from searching for him. My phone rang before either of us decided what to do next. Colin's name appeared on the screen. Nora and I looked at each other, and I answered on speaker without telling him she was beside me. He did not ask how the party tape had been stored, whether we had found anything, or why I had not returned his earlier messages. He was silent long enough for me to hear him breathing. Then he said, "Please don't give that video to the police." I gripped the edge of the table. "What video, Colin?" He hesitated, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed into the measured tone he used with donors and families at his recovery program. He said Nora was upset, old camera clocks were unreliable, and childhood recordings could easily be misunderstood. He warned me not to destroy lives by turning a family disagreement into a criminal accusation. I asked him how he knew the recording had anything to do with the police. He ignored the question and told me I was letting one ugly moment at Mom's birthday poison everything. Then he ended the call. A message arrived less than a minute later, accusing me of tearing apart the family because he had moved a chair. Nora read it over my shoulder. "He didn't move that chair because he believed Dad was guilty," she said. "He moved it because he needed me to believe it." I closed Colin's message and opened the website of a nonprofit organization that reviewed wrongful convictions. The intake form asked for the convicted person's name, case number, type of new evidence, and whether the original source still existed. My hands shook as I entered Aaron's information, but I did not stop. The reply came late that evening from an attorney named Leah Grant. She said she was willing to review a copy of the recording and speak with us about preserving the original. Her message contained no promise that Aaron would be cleared, and no dramatic claim that we had solved the case. The first sentence beneath her introduction was more cautious than Nora wanted, and more hopeful than I deserved. "A timestamp can start a case. It cannot finish one." Leah Grant called the next morning, while Nora and I were still sitting at the kitchen table. The camcorder remained between us, but neither of us touched it. After the way Colin had reacted, the tape no longer felt like an old family recording. It felt like something that could be damaged simply by being handled carelessly. Leah appeared on my laptop screen from a narrow office lined with case files. She listened without interrupting, as Nora explained how she had found the tape, transferred it using school equipment, and matched the storm warning on the television to the local broadcast archive. Then Leah asked questions that stripped away the certainty we had felt the night before. Had the camcorder's clock ever been reset? Could anyone have paused the recording? Was the digital copy compressed? Could the reflection in the cabinet identify Colin clearly enough for someone who had never met him? Had the original tape remained in our possession since 2015? Nora answered honestly each time. She did not pretend the image was sharper than it was or claim technical expertise she did not have. When Leah finished, she leaned closer to the camera and said the timestamp alone would not clear Aaron. Old camcorder clocks could be changed, and a copied file could be challenged. The reflection showed suspicious behavior, but suspicion was not proof. I felt the hope from the night before begin to collapse. "So it means nothing?" "I didn't say that," Leah replied. "The tape may contain a verifiable alibi, but we need the original recording, the camera that made it, the weather broadcast, hospital access right. One clue starts the work. It does not finish it." She asked me to show her the mini DV cassette without removing it from its case. I held it near the laptop camera, while Nora showed her the camcorder and the transfer equipment. Leah told us not to record over anything, clean the tape, open the cassette, or make additional edits. She would arrange for the original to be sent directly to a media preservation specialist who could document its condition and create a forensic copy. Then she explained something I had been afraid to ask. Her organization was a non-profit legal clinic connected to a law school and supported by grants. Because the original tape still existed, and the weather warning offered an independent way to test the alibi. They were willing to take an initial review of Aaron's case pro bono. I would not have to find money for a private post-conviction attorney before anyone agreed to look at the evidence. Relief came with shame attached. I owned a small alterations shop and lived carefully from month to month. For years, the cost of reopening Aaron's case had been one more excuse I used when I wanted to believe nothing could be done. Leah removed that excuse in less than a minute. She asked for Aaron's current contact information. I stared at the blank line on the intake form, though I knew his number by memory. He lived in a town several hours away and repaired small boat engines and industrial machinery. We had spoken only a few times that year, mostly about Nora's school documents or medical insurance forms that still carried both our names. "You need his consent before you go further," Leah said. "This is his conviction and his life. Finding new evidence does not give anyone else the right to decide how he should use it." I knew she was speaking to both Nora and me, but the words landed differently on each of us. Nora wanted her father's name cleared. I wanted a chance to correct something I had helped break. Aaron might want neither, if it meant reopening the worst years of his life. After the call ended, Nora carried the tape to her room so she could pack it exactly as Leah instructed. I stayed at the table with Aaron's number on my phone. I had rehearsed apologies to him for 11 years, but every version had centered my guilt rather than his loss. He answered after the 6th ring. Machinery hummed somewhere behind him, then stopped abruptly. "Monica?" Hearing my name in his voice made the years between us feel physical. I told him Nora had found a second recording from my mother's birthday, one that had never been included on the family DVD. I explained the storm warning, the hospital access time, and the continuous footage showing him inside the house. He did not respond when I finished. I heard a metal tool placed on a workbench and the slow release of his breath. Finally, he asked, "Who has the tape?" "We do. A lawyer is arranging to preserve it." "A lawyer?" "A wrongful conviction clinic. They're reviewing the case without charging us." His voice hardened. "Us?" The word made me realize how easily I had placed myself beside him again. "They're reviewing your case. Nora and I found the evidence, but Leah said nothing moves without your permission." Aaron was quiet for so long that I checked whether the call had disconnected. When he spoke, the anger in his voice was controlled enough to hurt more than shouting would have. "You found 14 minutes, he said. "I lost 11 years. I know." "No, Monica. You know there's a tape. That isn't the same thing." I closed my eyes. He reminded me that he had spent months in the county jail before accepting the plea agreement. The prosecutor had threatened more than 10 years if he went to trial and lost. His badge had opened the hospital corridor. His jacket matched the figure on camera. Medication had been found in his work vehicle. His own wife had signed a statement saying he left the party angry before the break-in. Nora had returned to the kitchen without my noticing. She stopped near the doorway when she heard the last sentence. Aaron continued before I could answer. "Why do you believe a camera now when you couldn't believe me then?" There was no truthful response that protected me. I told him our marriage had already been strained. He had hidden a disciplinary argument with his manager because he did not want me to worry. I knew he had shouted at hospital administrators over a broken lock near the medication storage area. When the drugs were found in his vehicle, every concern I had ever carried about his temper suddenly seemed like evidence. "My mother said you left before the warning." I admitted. "Colin said the same thing. I remembered you walking out angry later, and I let their certainty replace the part I couldn't remember." "You signed it?" "Yes." Nora stepped fully into the room. Her face changed as she understood that this was not merely another detail from the case. I had never told her that my statement helped turn Aaron's anger at 8:55 into an absence at 8:18. Aaron asked whether Nora was listening. I told him she was. His voice softened slightly when he said her name, but he did not ask to speak with her. He was still deciding whether this new hope was another danger. Before ending the call, he mentioned something he had told his public defender years ago. The amount of medication the hospital claimed was stolen had never made sense as a single event. During his detention, he overheard that an inventory employee believed the losses had accumulated over several months. "Do you remember his name?" I asked. "Owen Bennett. His signature was on one of the inventory summaries." My lawyer tried to get the full report, but the hospital turned over a revised version. Aaron also reminded me that he had filed 2 maintenance requests about the storage area lock. The latch could be forced if someone already knew where the mechanism caught. His warnings had later been used to argue that he understood how to enter the room. Leah had said a verifiable alibi could reopen the question of where Aaron was. An inventory report showing months of losses could change the question entirely. The break-in might not have been the beginning of the theft. It might have been built to make older shortages look like one night's crime. After Aaron agreed to let Leah review the file, he ended the call without thanking me or promising to speak again. He had given us permission to examine the case, not permission to return to his life. Nora remained near the doorway. Her eyes were fixed on the laptop, where Leah had already sent a secure link containing several documents from the public court record. One of them carried my name. She opened the affidavit before I could stop her. My signature appeared beneath a paragraph stating that Aaron left my mother's house angry before the emergency warning and was absent during the estimated time of the hospital entry. "I thought I was confirming what everyone remembered," I said. Nora looked up. "Did Dad tell you he was there?" "Yes." "And you believed Grandma instead?" I wanted to explain the pressure, the evidence in the vehicle, the months of fear, and the way my mother could turn uncertainty into disobedience. Every explanation sounded like an attempt to make my choice less damaging. "They framed him," Nora said, her voice shaking. "But you helped them make it believable." I did not deny it. I told her I had been frightened, angry, and desperate for someone to make the facts simple. Evelyn had offered a version in which Aaron had betrayed us, and the rest of the family had protected Nora and me. I accepted it because believing my husband had failed us felt easier than admitting my mother and brother might be capable of destroying him. Nora closed the affidavit. The sound of the laptop shutting was small, but it carried more judgment than anything Aaron had said. "Before we clear Dad's name," she told me, "I need to know how much of his life you helped them take." Nora did not speak to me again that night. She took the photocopy of my affidavit to her room and closed the door, leaving me alone with the recording, Aaron's anger, and the knowledge that my signature had helped turn a lie into a conviction. By morning, I had barely slept, but Colin had already begun shaping another version of the truth. My phone filled with messages from relatives who had ignored Nora at the birthday party. One aunt asked whether Nora had altered the footage for a school project. A cousin reminded me that old camcorder clocks could be reset by anyone. Colin's oldest son wrote that his father had dedicated his life to helping families destroyed by addiction and did not deserve to have his reputation ruined over a childhood video. The wording was too similar to be accidental. Each person claimed to be contacting me privately, yet they repeated the same 3 ideas. Nora knew how to edit video. I was angry about the chair. Colin was being attacked because he had become successful. Then my mother called. I let it ring twice before answering. "Colin is trying to protect everyone," Evelyn said. She did not ask how Nora was feeling or whether the recording showed Aaron at home. "You are allowing your daughter to turn one cruel remark into a campaign against her uncle." He asked me not to give the video to the police, because he knows what public accusations can do. His recovery program depends on trust. So did Aaron's marriage. My mother went silent for a moment, then lowered her voice. "You need to stop confusing guilt with grief, Monica. You made choices 11 years ago. Nora finding a tape does not erase them. She knew exactly where to strike. If she could make my guilt feel like proof that I was acting irrationally, she would not have to address what the video showed." I told her I would not discuss the tape with her, then ended the call before she could remind me how many people depended on Colin. Nora came downstairs after hearing my voice. She placed her phone on the table and showed me a post Colin had shared through the social media page of his recovery organization. He did not name us, but he wrote about the danger of families using edited memories to punish people who had rebuilt their lives. Beneath it, former clients praised his honesty and called him a man who had spent years standing between vulnerable people and destructive accusations. "He's making himself the victim," Nora said. "He's making the video look fake before anyone outside the family sees it." She opened the clip she had transferred from the mini DV tape. "Then we show everyone. We post the whole thing, including the weather warning and him taking Dad's keys. Let people decide who's lying." Her finger hovered over the upload button. I understood the hunger behind the decision. For 11 years, other people had spoken about Aaron while Nora remained quiet. Posting the video would give her hundreds of witnesses within minutes. It would also surrender control of the evidence to strangers who could crop it, compress it, repost it without context, or turn it into an argument about whether a 17-year-old knew how to manipulate old footage. "No," I said. Her expression hardened. "You're protecting him again. I'm protecting the tape. That is what you always say. Wait. Be careful. Don't make things worse." She was repeating every lesson my mother had taught me, and I hated that my decision sounded so similar. I moved away from the laptop so she could see I was not trying to take it from her. "If we put this online, Colin will say the file was edited before anyone examined the original. People believing us for a week is not the same as a court accepting what happened. I want your father's name changed in the record, not defended in a comment section." Nora looked toward the camcorder. "And what if the court does what everyone else did? Then we fight with the original still intact." She did not agree, but she closed the upload window. The movement was sharp enough to tell me she was obeying the process, not forgiving me. That distinction mattered. For once, I was willing to let my daughter be angry if the boundary protected something more important than my comfort. Leah called before noon. Colin's public claims did not surprise her. She said discrediting the person who found evidence was easier than explaining the evidence itself. The safest response was not to argue with every relative, but to document what had been said, preserve the original media, and avoid publicly describing details only the people involved would know. She arranged for the mini DV tape and the camcorder to be examined by a media preservation specialist who worked with her clinic. The specialist would photograph the cassette, document its physical condition, create a bit-for-bit working copy, and inspect the recording for stops, breaks, or later splices. Leah made it clear that this would not prove Colin committed the theft, but it could establish that the tape had not been edited after Nora recorded it. We packed the cassette under Leah's instructions. Nora wrote the date and time on the evidence form, then watched me sign beneath her name. We placed the original tape in a protective case, sealed it in a tamper-evident envelope, and delivered it to the insured courier Leah had arranged. The camcorder traveled in a separate, padded container so the specialist could test the data display and examine whether the internal clock had been altered. "Do not tell anyone where it is," Leah said. "Not your mother, not Colin, not a relative who claims to be neutral. From this point forward, anyone asking about the original should be directed to me." After the courier left, the kitchen felt strangely empty. We still had the digital working copy on Nora's external hard drive and the family DVD, but the object everyone feared was no longer in our house. Nora stared through the window until the delivery van disappeared. "At least they can't say we changed it after today," she said. It was not forgiveness, but it was the first time since reading my affidavit that she had used the word we. I retrieved the family DVD from the cabinet and examined the label more carefully. Evelyn's handwriting listed the birthday date across the top, but along the lower edge, almost hidden beneath the plastic ring, someone had written the conversion date. It was 6 weeks after Aaron's arrest. I showed Nora. "This was never the original." She turned the disc toward the light. Grandma called it the family copy. She let everyone believe the copy contained everything. The distinction was small enough to escape notice for 11 years, and large enough to change what the family had accepted as fact. Colin was sending relatives a DVD created after the arrest and calling it the original recording. He was not defending an old memory. He was defending an edited product. I photographed the label and sent the images to Leah. Then I stopped responding to family messages. Every defense I typed gave Colin another sentence to distort, and every argument kept me inside the role my mother preferred, the frightened daughter asking to be believed. Late that afternoon, Evelyn called again. Her voice sounded unsteady, but I had heard her manufacture fragility before. "I found something," she said. "Letters Aaron sent from prison." My hand tightened around the phone. For years, my mother had insisted Aaron rarely wrote and eventually stopped trying to contact Nora. Aaron had told me the opposite, but by then I had believed almost nothing he said. "How many letters?" "I don't know. There is a box Colin kept because he thought Nora was too young to read them." Nora had entered the room and heard enough to understand. Her face lost its anger for a moment, replaced by the expression of a child waiting for something that should have arrived years earlier. "Bring them here," I said. "I can't. Not until we talk. There are things you need to understand about that night, and I want to tell you before this destroys what is left of the family." I no longer trusted her tears or her timing. She had ignored us until the original tape left our hands, then suddenly found letters and a confession. Still, I could not hang up while the possibility existed that Aaron had spent years writing to a daughter who believed he had forgotten her. Nora whispered that she wanted to go. Then she looked directly at me and added, "If she lies again, I'm leaving. I don't care what she promises." "We leave together," I told her. Before we drove to Evelyn's house, I forwarded her message to Leah and told her where we were going. Nora backed up the digital copy, disconnected the external hard drive, and left it beside the old family DVD on the work table. The empty camcorder case lay nearby, but the camera itself had gone to the specialist with the sealed tape that morning. I checked the back door, closed the windows, and locked the front door behind us. Inside the quiet house, the hard drive and our notes remained in plain sight. The original mini-DV recording was already beyond Colin's reach, and only Nora, Leah, and I knew where it had gone. My mother opened the door before Nora and I reached the porch. Evelyn had removed her lipstick, and her eyes were red around the edges, but I could not tell whether she had been crying or had prepared herself to look as though she had. She pulled Nora into a hug without asking permission, then held on long enough to make my daughter stiffen. "I don't want us hurting each other anymore," she said as she led us into the living room. "This family has survived enough." Nothing in the room had changed since her birthday. The gold decorations were gone, but the chair Colin had dragged away from Nora still stood against the wall. My mother had not returned it to the table. Nora saw it too. Her gaze stayed there while Evelyn asked whether we wanted tea. I told her we had not come for tea. We had come for Aaron's letters. My mother lowered herself onto the sofa and placed a folded sheet of paper on the coffee table. It was a photocopy, not an envelope. Aaron's handwriting crossed the page in dark block letters I recognized immediately. Nora reached for it before I could. The copy contained only the middle portion of a letter. There was no date, no return address, and no page before or after it. Most of the paragraph discussed a prison education class and a book Aaron hoped Nora might read someday. Near the bottom, one sentence had been underlined in blue ink. "Please tell Nora I did not leave her." Nora read it twice. Her fingers tightened around the paper until the edge bent. "When did he send this?" she asked. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest. "A long time ago." "How long?" "You were a child. There were things you could not understand." Nora looked up. "You told me he stopped writing." "I said he stopped sending anything appropriate for you." The distinction was as careful as everything my mother said when she wanted a lie to survive contact with the truth. She had not denied receiving Aaron's letters. She had only decided that Nora never deserved to know they existed. "Where are the rest?" I asked. Evelyn glanced toward the hallway. "Colin has the box." "Why would Colin have letters addressed to my daughter?" He was helping me make sensible decisions. Aaron was angry, confused, and blaming everyone around him. Colin believed those letters would keep Nora trapped in false hope. Nora placed the photocopy flat on the table. "You mean hope that my father still loved me?" My mother's face tightened. Hope that a convicted man would suddenly become someone different. I wanted to answer, but Nora stood before I could. She paced toward the window, clutching the copy against her chest. The room had already given her more pain than information, yet Evelyn continued speaking in the soft voice she used when cruelty needed to sound responsible. I asked why Colin had called me the moment we found the video. My mother said he feared I would make a public accusation and destroy the recovery program. She reminded me how many people depended on him, how many parents called him when their children relapsed, and how quickly donors could abandon an organization when scandal appeared. "He asked me not to give it to the police," I said. "He did not ask me not to put it online." Evelyn picked at an invisible thread on her sleeve. "People say imprecise things when they are frightened." What was he frightened of? Losing everything over a misunderstanding. She began apologizing, but none of the apologies contained an action. She was sorry that Aaron's case had divided us. She was sorry Nora had grown up angry. She was sorry Colin had spoken harshly at the birthday dinner. Each sentence floated above the facts without touching them. Whenever I asked for the letters, she returned to the family. Whenever I asked what she had seen in the video, she spoke about Colin's reputation. When Nora asked whether Aaron had written every month, Evelyn offered to make sandwiches. The longer she delayed, the more aware I became of the clock above the fireplace. We had been there nearly 40 minutes. My mother did not intend to give us the box, and she was no longer trying to persuade us of anything. She was keeping us in the room. I stood. "We're leaving." Evelyn's hand closed around my wrist. "Monica, sit down. There is more you need to hear." "Then say it now." Her eyes moved toward the front window. The motion was quick, but I saw it. I pulled my arm away and looked at Nora. She had already reached the same conclusion. We left the photocopy on the table for 1 second before Nora turned back and took it. My mother had withheld enough of her father's words. She would not keep the one page she had chosen to use as bait. The drive home took 12 minutes. Nora called my name when our house came into view because the kitchen light was on. I knew I had turned it off before we left. The front door was still locked. Around the back, there were no broken windows or damaged hinges, but the door stood slightly open. The lock itself had not been forced. My mother had kept a spare key for years. I had forgotten about it because she had stopped visiting after Aaron's conviction, unless she called first. The possibility that she had given it to Colin made my stomach turn before we even stepped inside. I told Nora to wait outside and called the police. She refused to move farther than the porch, so we remained there until an officer arrived and cleared the rooms. No one was inside. At first, the kitchen looked untouched. My wallet remained beside the refrigerator. The cash envelope for my shop's fabric delivery was still in a drawer. Nora's laptop sat on the couch, and the small jewelry box in my bedroom had not been opened. Then we entered the workroom. The external hard drive was gone. So was the borrowed transfer camcorder from Nora's school, the box containing the other family tapes, the official birthday DVD, and the notebook in which we had written the time marks from the recording. The empty case from Aaron's old camera had been taken as well. Nothing else was missing. Nora stared at the bare section of the table and began opening drawers as if the objects might have moved themselves. "The tape," she said. "Where is the original tape?" "It isn't here." Her face collapsed before I could explain. "You made me leave. You knew Grandma was lying, and we still went." "I know. They took everything because you still needed to hear her excuse." She struck the side of the table with her palm. The anger did not surprise me. What frightened me was how quickly it turned into panic. I called Leah, and put her on speaker. She answered before the second ring. When I told her what had been taken, she asked whether the tamper-evident package had reached the preservation specialist. I opened the courier tracking page with shaking hands. The package had been signed for 43 minutes earlier. The original mini DV tape and Aaron's camcorder are secured at the lab, Leah said. The stolen drive contained a working copy, not the only copy. Do not touch anything else until the police finish documenting the room. Nora lowered herself into a chair. Relief did not erase her anger, but it gave her somewhere to breathe. The safety of the original was not the result of a trap I had cleverly set for Colin. We had sent it away because Leah followed a proper process. For most of my life, I had treated caution as a form of surrender. That night, caution was the only reason the truth still existed. I photographed the room after the officer permitted me to enter. My years of writing alteration tickets and inventorying customers' garments helped me list each missing object by model, color, identifying mark, and last known location. The officer said the absence of forced entry suggested someone had used a key, but he could not accuse my brother based on family suspicion. The items were specific. Yet, specificity alone did not prove who had taken them. Nora gave the officer a copy of Evelyn's message asking us to come over. I showed him the courier receipt and Colin's earlier call. He wrote everything down without promising an arrest. My phone vibrated while he was still standing in the workroom. The message came from Colin. Perhaps now you understand why old things should stay buried. I showed the screen to the officer. I had not told Colin, my mother, or any relative that we had returned to a broken lock, a missing drive, or an empty work table. I had not posted anything online. The police had been at the house for less than 20 minutes. Colin knew something had happened to the old things, because the person who entered my home had taken nothing else. The officer photographed the message and asked me not to respond. I obeyed, though every part of me wanted to call my brother and force him to explain how a man who claimed innocence knew the contents of a room he had no right to enter. After the police left, Nora sat on the kitchen floor with Aaron's photocopied letter in her lap. She traced the sentence with one finger, then looked toward the empty workroom. They didn't just make people think Dad was guilty, she said. They made me think he chose not to love me. I sat beside her. I could not promise that we would recover every letter or repair every year. I could only tell her that I would no longer protect the people who had taken them. That night, after Nora finally went to bed, my mother called again. I nearly ignored it, but something in me needed to hear what she would say now that Colin's attempt to seize the evidence had failed. Evelyn did not greet me or ask whether we were safe. Her breathing trembled across the line before she spoke. Colin did not cut the video, she said. I did. I agreed to meet my mother the next afternoon, but not at her house. Leah knew the time and location. Nora came with me, and we chose a table in the back of a hotel cafe where other people were close enough to prevent another private performance from becoming a trap. Evelyn arrived, carrying a leather folder against her chest. She looked smaller than she had at her birthday, but I had finally learned that weakness and innocence were not the same thing. She began without ordering anything. I told the editor to remove part of the video, she said. Colin had nothing to do with it. Nora's hand tightened around the photocopied prison letter in her lap. I asked my mother which part she had removed and why. Evelyn said Aaron had been drinking, shouting at Colin, and frightening Nora. According to her, the missing footage showed him losing control before storming out of the house. She claimed she cut it because she did not want a 6-year-old child growing up with a recording of her father behaving violently. The explanation was almost believable because it borrowed pieces of real history. Aaron and Colin had argued that night. Aaron had left angry later. Our marriage had been strained, and Aaron's temper had already made me uneasy. My mother did not need to invent an entirely false man. She only needed to move his worst moment to a more useful time. Colin never knew I changed the video, she continued. He believed the family copy was complete. I made that decision alone. Nora looked directly at her. Then, how did he know we found another tape? Evelyn's eyes shifted toward the window. She said Colin had guessed, because I had become hostile after the birthday dinner. When I reminded her that he had specifically asked me not to give the video to the police, she said frightened people often spoke carelessly. Then she tried to weaken the recording itself. A child could have stopped the camcorder and started it again. Aaron might have left during a gap. The clock might have been wrong. The weather report might have been replayed later. Her objections came too smoothly for a woman who claimed she had only just learned what the tape contained. I did not argue with her version of the night. Memory had already failed me once, and I would not build another case from who sounded more certain. Instead, I asked why the storm warning's audio continued without interruption, while Aaron remained in the room. "You cannot let 14 minutes erase 11 years of truth," she said. The sentence settled between us. I had never told Evelyn the missing interval was 14 minutes. I had not told any relative. Colin's public post referred only to an old family recording, and the police report from the break-in did not include the contents of the tape. Nora leaned forward. "How do you know it was 14 minutes? My mother's mouth opened, but no answer came. She reached for the water glass and missed it slightly, striking the rim with her fingers. Then she said she must have heard the number from Colin, which only moved the problem from one conspirator to another. My phone vibrated against the table. Leah had sent the preliminary report from the preservation specialist. The original mini-DV tape showed no recording break, pause, or splice between 8:12 and 8:26 p.m. The continuous audio signal matched the storm warning archived by the television station. The report did not declare Aaron innocent or identify Colin, but it eliminated the gap Evelyn had just tried to create. I turned the screen toward her. The tape did not stop. She barely looked at it. "Experts can be wrong. Then why did you cut those exact 14 minutes from the family copy?" Her face hardened. The grieving mother disappeared, replaced by the woman who had taught me that family peace meant accepting whatever version protected Colin. She said she had done what was necessary after Aaron's arrest. The family was being watched, Nora was being whispered about at school, and I was barely functioning. Removing an ugly scene had seemed merciful. "You did not remove an ugly scene," I said. "You removed his alibi." Evelyn stood so quickly that her chair scraped the floor. Several people turned toward us. She lowered her voice and told me I was destroying the only family still willing to claim me. Then she left the leather folder unopened on the table and walked out. There were no letters inside it, only blank paper weighted beneath an old photograph of Nora sitting on Aaron's shoulders. My mother had brought the image of love, not the evidence of it. By the time Nora and I reached home, an email from a civil attorney was waiting in my inbox. The subject line called it a proposal for private family resolution. Leah reviewed it with us over a video call before I opened the attachment. The document did not ask me to destroy evidence or refuse a lawful request from police or a court. It offered a written apology to Nora, the return of Aaron's prison letters, and an agreement ending public statements by both sides. In exchange, I would acknowledge that the camcorder timestamp had not yet been judicially verified and agree not to release the footage to social media, news outlets, donors, or clients connected to Colin's recovery program. A second clause proposed, placing the original recording with a neutral forensic custodian chosen by both parties during a private evaluation period. On the surface, it sounded careful and legal. Colin was not asking his lawyer to commit a crime. He was asking for enough control to slow the evidence, isolate it from public scrutiny, and make every next step negotiable. Nora stopped reading when she reached the promise to return the letters. All of them? The proposal said every surviving letter in Colin's possession would be delivered after the agreement was signed. I watched hope move across her face before she could hide it. Those pages might contain years of birthdays, apologies, explanations, and proof that Aaron had continued trying to reach her. Colin had found the one thing Nora wanted badly enough to consider silence. "We could sign the part about not posting it," she said. "We already decided not to put it online." Leah asked us to read the appendix before making any decision. The first paragraph described the disputed evidence as the original mini DV recording covering approximately 8:12 p.m. through 8:26 p.m. I read it again. Neither Colin nor his attorney had received the specialist's report. We had never publicly identified the cassette format. My mother had just exposed knowledge of the 14-minute interval, and now Colin's own legal proposal named both the exact medium and the exact window. He knows what is on the original, Nora said. Leah nodded. Or he knows what was removed from the other recording. A private message from Colin arrived while we were still on the call. He wrote that if I signed, the letters would be returned and the tape never has to become a public spectacle. He did not threaten me directly. He did something more familiar. He offered to restore what he had helped take, but only if I allowed him to control the truth. Nora stared at the clause about the letters. What if he burns them when we refuse? He might, I said. Her eyes filled, but she did not look away. Then we lose Dad's words again. I wanted to sign for her. Every instinct in me urged me to take the compromise, recover the box, and tell myself we could continue quietly afterward. That was how my family had controlled me for years. They never demanded that I choose evil. They offered something I loved and made surrender sound responsible. I closed the document. We are not trading your father's name for his letters. Nora began to cry without making a sound. I moved toward her, but she lifted one hand and asked for space. She understood my decision, yet understanding did not make the loss smaller. Leah saved the proposal, appendix, email headers, and Colin's message. The document intended to contain us had instead preserved his knowledge in a form he could not dismiss as a misunderstood phone call. Before ending the call, Leah uploaded the complete copy of my old affidavit. Nora opened it and found the paragraph she had seen before, this time surrounded by the questions the investigator had asked me. She placed the laptop in front of me. "Read it," she said. I tried to begin silently, but she shook her head. Out loud. My voice trembled as I read the sentence stating that Aaron left my mother's house in anger before the emergency warning and remained absent during the estimated time of the hospital entry. The words sounded decisive, as though I had watched a clock and followed him to the door. In reality, I had remembered his anger and accepted my mother's timeline. When I finished, Nora asked which part I had personally seen. I told her I had seen Aaron leave angry, but not before the warning. I had not checked the time. I had repeated what Evelyn and Colin said, until their sequence felt like my own memory. "Then correct it," she said. This time I did not ask what correcting it might do to me. Leah explained that a revised statement would invite questions about why I had signed the first one, and whether I had knowingly misled investigators. It could damage my credibility before it repaired Aaron's. I told her to prepare it anyway. I would not clear my conscience by pointing only at Colin. My false certainty had helped the case survive. The truth required me to place my own failure into the record. As Leah searched the archived file for the original interview exhibits, she stopped at a document attached to the hospital inventory. At the bottom was the signature of Owen Bennett. Beside it, a handwritten notation stated that the quantity missing was not consistent with a single event. Leah enlarged the sentence and placed the report beside the access log from the night of the break-in. If Bennett was right, she said, the burglary did not cause the missing drugs. The burglary was built to hide them. Leah found Owen Bennett through the address attached to an old professional license. He had retired from hospital compliance 6 years earlier and lived 2 counties away, but he remembered Aaron's case before she finished describing it. His name was already on the inventory document, and Aaron had mentioned him during our first call, so he did not arrive as a miraculous witness. He had been sitting inside the record all along, reduced to a signature beneath a report someone else had rewritten. We spoke with him through a video call from the back room of my alteration shop. Nora sat beside me while Leah asked the questions. Owen was a narrow-faced man with silver hair and the careful manner of someone who had spent a career knowing that one misplaced number could cost people their jobs. He told us he had kept handwritten notes from the 2015 audit because he objected to the final version and feared he might someday be blamed for it. The shortage did not begin on the night of the break-in, he said. That was the part they wanted removed. Owen's original counts showed controlled medication disappearing in small amounts across several months. No single loss was large enough to trigger an immediate crisis, but the pattern became visible when he compared pharmacy transfers, floor inventories, and medication exchanges between shifts. The discrepancies appeared most often around evenings when Colin worked, covered another nurse's rotation, or handled returns after medication changes. The hospital had scheduled a formal inventory for the morning after my mother's birthday. Before that count could begin, someone entered through the service corridor, disturbed the storage area, and created what looked like one large theft. Management then listed every missing dose from the previous months as part of that single incident. They wanted a burglary, Owen said. A burglary meant one intruder, one night, and one insurance report. A pattern meant interviewing staff, reviewing months of access, notifying regulators, and admitting the hospital had failed to control narcotics. His supervisor ordered him to remove the language saying the losses were inconsistent with a single event. Owen refused at first. Then he was warned that the hospital would accuse him of mishandling the audit if he delayed the investigation. He signed the revised summary, but kept his original notes and a copy of the first spreadsheet. Leah placed both reports on the screen. The revised version compressed months of missing medication into one number beside the date of the break-in. Owen's notes divided that same number across repeated shortages. The difference changed the entire case. Aaron had not been framed merely to take responsibility for one stolen supply. The staged entry had been designed to erase a pattern that pointed toward someone already inside the hospital. Leah opened Aaron's maintenance reports next. 2 months before the crime, he had documented that the mechanical latch near the service corridor could be manipulated if pressure was applied at a particular angle. The hospital never repaired it. After his arrest, prosecutors used the report to argue that Aaron possessed specialized knowledge of the weak door. Owen shook his head. He reported a danger, and they turned the warning into evidence against him. Colin had needed Aaron's badge only to enter the corridor without using his own nursing credentials. Once inside, he could exploit the faulty latch Aaron had already described. The security camera would show a person in Aaron's maintenance jacket, using Aaron's access card and arriving in Aaron's vehicle. Meanwhile, Colin's own account would remain absent from the electronic trail. Leah arranged the documents in chronological order. For the first time, the case no longer looked like a collection of suspicious details. It became one continuous action. Colin had diverted small quantities of medication for months. The coming inventory threatened to reveal that the losses clustered around his shifts and medication exchanges. At approximately 7:40 on the night of Evelyn's birthday, he took Aaron's red key fob, maintenance badge, jacket, and vehicle. He reached the hospital before 8:18, entered the service corridor, and staged a larger theft so the earlier losses could be blamed on one event. He placed some of the diverted medication inside Aaron's toolbox, then returned to Evelyn's house around 8:47. Near 8:55, Colin provoked Aaron into leaving angrily. Evelyn later cut the continuous video, showing Aaron at the house between 8:12 and 8:26, then repeated that he had left before the warning, until the family attached his genuine anger to the wrong hour. I carried their timeline into my affidavit. The media specialist's final report arrived, while Owen was still on the call. The original mini-DV tape showed no pause, splice, or later overwrite during the critical period. Its recording characteristics matched the camcorder Nora had found. The audio remained continuous, and the tornado broadcast corresponded with the television station's archive transmission. The specialist had also extracted a clearer frame of Colin returning through the rear passage. The tear near the cuff of Aaron's jacket formed a narrow hooked shape. Leah compared it with an old crime scene photograph showing a bent metal catch beside the hospital service door. A dark fiber had been caught on the latch. The original investigators had documented the fiber but never tested it against the jacket because the jacket itself was treated as proof of Aaron's presence. The tier did not independently convict Colin, but it joined the key fob, badge, vehicle, timeline, inventory pattern, and Evelyn's instruction to return the property before I noticed. When the call ended, Nora remained beside the laptop, staring at Owen's first spreadsheet. "He chose Dad because every honest thing Dad did could be made to look guilty," she said. Aaron had reported the broken lock, so he knew how it worked. He had argued with management, so he appeared resentful. He had left the party angry, so his absence could be moved backward. His jacket, badge, vehicle, and toolbox gave Colin the physical pieces. Our troubled marriage gave my family the emotional story. I called Aaron before Leah filed anything. I explained what Owen had preserved and how the staged break-in had hidden months of theft. I told him the video expert had authenticated the recording and that the torn jacket matched the service door latch. Then I said the only question that mattered was whether he wanted Leah to seek withdrawal of his plea and vacatur of the conviction. He did not answer immediately. I could hear tools moving somewhere in his workshop, followed by a door closing. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Yes, I want my name back." I told him Leah would need his signature and cooperation. I did not mention Nora, our marriage, or the years I wished I could change. Aaron did. "Monica, clearing the conviction does not put us back where we were. I know. I will work with Leah. I will speak to Nora when she wants. But this is not a road back to our marriage." I understand. The answer hurt, but it also returned something I had taken from him 11 years earlier. He was choosing what happened next. I was no longer deciding which version of his life he had to accept. By afternoon, Colin had posted a statement claiming I was attempting to extort him with altered family footage. He said I had demanded letters, money, and public humiliation in exchange for silence. Several local supporters shared the post before he removed it. Leah saved every version. She also preserved the private settlement proposal, its appendix identifying the mini DV format, an exact 8:12 to 8:26 window, and Colin's messages offering Aaron's letters in exchange for control of the recording. His public accusations said I had invented a demand. His own documents showed the offer had come from him. Evelyn arrived at my shop before closing. She stood between two racks of unfinished dresses and told me I still had time to stop. "You are choosing a dead marriage over the family that is still alive," she said. "Aaron left years ago. Colin is here. I am here." I folded the garment in my hands and placed it on the work table. "Nora is also family that is still alive." My mother's expression changed, but I continued before she could speak. "You let her pay for what Colin did. You let her believe her father abandoned her. You watched him move her chair, because keeping her ashamed protected both of you." Evelyn said I would regret destroying my brother. I told her the destruction began when she taught us that Colin's future mattered more than Aaron's freedom and Nora's childhood. She left without another word. Leah filed the petition with Aaron's authorization, attaching the authenticated video report, weather archive, original audit notes, maintenance complaints, Colin's proposal, his private messages, and my notice that I intended to correct my old affidavit. The court did not erase the conviction that day. It accepted the petition for review and scheduled an evidentiary hearing. That night, I sat alone at my kitchen table with the revised statement open before me. For 11 years, I had told myself I signed the first affidavit because I was confused. The new evidence forced me to admit that confusion was only part of it. I had also accepted the memory that required the least courage from me. I placed my fingers on the keyboard and wrote the first line. The memory I swore was mine was given to me by my mother. On the morning of the evidentiary hearing, Aaron sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. Leah had reserved a chair for him near our table, but he chose one behind his attorney instead. The distance was only a few feet, yet it held 11 years of prison visits that never happened, letters Nora never received, and a statement bearing my signature. Nora sat beside me with both hands folded in her lap. She had asked whether the judge would declare Colin guilty that day, and Leah had corrected her gently. This hearing was not Colin's trial. The court was deciding whether Aaron's conviction and guilty plea could still stand after the evidence supporting them had become unreliable. That distinction mattered. We were not there to demand punishment before an investigation. We were there to return one man's name to him. Leah began with the mini DV tape. She explained where Nora had found it, how we had transferred a working copy, and when the sealed original had left our custody. The preservation specialist described receiving the package, photographing the cassette and camera, documenting their condition, and creating a forensic copy without altering the original. The prosecutor asked whether the camcorder's timestamp could have been changed. The specialist agreed that it could. For one terrible second, I felt the old certainty closing around Aaron again. Then she explained why the case did not depend on the camera clock. The tape contained continuous audio with no pause, splice, or overwrite. The television in Evelyn's living room showed a live tornado warning preserved in the station's archive. The alert began at 8:12 p.m. and ended at 8:26. The presenter's words, the counties highlighted on the map, and the changes in the broadcast matched the recording in real time. The hospital was approximately 24 minutes from Evelyn's house. Aaron's badge opened the service corridor at 8:18, while Aaron remained visible beside the television tying Nora's shoe. The courtroom lights dimmed as the recording appeared on a large screen. At 7:40, Colin's reflection moved inside the glass cabinet. He removed Aaron's red leather key fob, maintenance badge, and jacket, then left through the side door. The image was imperfect, but Nora's handmade keychain flashed clearly enough to identify it. At 8:12, the tornado warning began. Aaron helped Evelyn's husband move away from the windows and stayed in the living room as the minutes advanced. At 8:18, when his badge was being used at the hospital, he was kneeling in front of our daughter. No one in the courtroom spoke, while 6-year-old Nora complained that her shoelace felt too tight. Aaron loosened it, retied the bow, and told her she would trip if the family needed to move quickly. At 8:47, Colin returned through the rear passage with Aaron's jacket folded under his arm. The right cuff was torn. Evelyn looked toward the dining room and said, "Put it back before Monica notices." The video continued until nearly 8:55, when Colin approached Aaron and provoked the argument my family later used against him. Aaron pushed back his chair and left through the front door. The event I remembered had happened. The time I attached to it had not. Owen Bennett testified next. He placed his original inventory notes beside the revised hospital report and explained that controlled medication had disappeared in small quantities over several months. The losses often occurred around shifts Colin worked, covered, or handled medication returns. The hospital's formal inventory had been scheduled for the morning after Evelyn's birthday. The staged break-in allowed management to combine months of discrepancies into one large theft. Owen testified that a supervisor ordered him to remove the sentence, stating that the missing quantities were inconsistent with a single event. Aaron then spoke about the faulty service door latch. He had reported it twice because pressure applied at one point could defeat the mechanical lock. After his arrest, those maintenance reports were no longer treated as evidence that the hospital ignored a security problem. They became proof that he knew how to enter. The prosecutor asked why Aaron accepted a guilty plea if he had been innocent. He described months in county detention, the drugs discovered in his work vehicle, the badge log, the blurred figure wearing his jacket, and my statement placing him away from the party. "They told me I could take 5 years," he said, "or risk more than 10 and lose what was left of my daughter's childhood." His eyes moved briefly toward Nora, but never reached me. Then Leah called my name. I walked to the witness stand, carrying the revised affidavit I had written and rewritten until no sentence allowed me to hide behind my mother. After I was sworn in, Leah asked what I had personally seen on the night of the crime. "I saw Aaron leave the party angry," I said. I did not see him leave before the tornado warning. I did not look at a clock. She asked why my original statement said otherwise. My mother and brother repeated that Aaron left before the warning. I remembered the argument that happened later, and I let their certainty decide where it belonged. The prosecutor reminded me that I had signed the affidavit voluntarily. I agreed. No one had held my hand to the page. No one had threatened Nora in that interview room. I had been frightened by the evidence, angry about the secrets Aaron kept from me, and relieved that my mother offered a version in which the danger came from outside our family. I looked toward the judge and forced myself to finish. I repeated her memory until I mistook it for mine. Across the aisle, Nora lowered her head. I could not tell whether she was crying, but I understood that watching me admit the truth did not erase what my first statement had cost her. Leah did not ask me to explain further. My responsibility did not become smaller because someone else designed the lie. After a recess, the prosecutor returned and acknowledged that the original case could no longer be defended with confidence. Aaron's alibi during the hospital entry was independently supported. The theft pattern predated the break-in. The old evidence involving his badge, jacket, vehicle, and maintenance knowledge now appeared capable of having been deliberately assembled. The state did not oppose Aaron's request to withdraw his plea and vacate the conviction. The judge did not deliver a dramatic speech. She reviewed the findings, granted the motion, and directed the clerk to begin the required process of correcting Aaron's record. The investigation into Colin, Evelyn, the recent burglary at my home, and the handling of the hospital audit would continue separately. A few sentences ended the legal force of a conviction that had shaped every day of Nora's childhood. When the hearing ended, people stood around Aaron, offering hands and quiet congratulations. He thanked Leah and spoke with his attorney. He did not turn toward me, and I did not cross the room to demand that he recognize what I had done. Outside the courthouse, Colin stepped from behind a row of reporters. He looked thinner than he had at Evelyn's birthday, and his polished calm had disappeared. "You destroyed a program that saves lives," he told me. "Do you know how many people will lose help because of you? You built that program on a man you let go to prison. I made mistakes when I was sick. Taking drugs was a mistake you could have admitted. Framing Aaron was a decision. Stealing the evidence 11 years later was another one." Colin glanced at Nora, perhaps expecting her to lower her eyes, as she had at the birthday table. She held his gaze until he looked away. Leah joined us, before he could move closer. She informed him that the settlement proposal, the appendix identifying the mini DV tape, and exact 14-minute interval, his private messages, and the evidence from the burglary at my home had been transferred to investigators. She also told us that the board of his recovery organization had suspended him pending review. Several relatives who had repeated Colin's claims had already contacted Leah. Once the video became part of the court record, their confidence began to fracture. Some remembered Colin leaving the party early. Others admitted Evelyn had instructed them to say Aaron was gone before the warning. The family story was no longer hers to arrange. Aaron walked down the courthouse steps alone. His conviction had been vacated, but he carried himself like a man leaving another institution that had taken something it could not return. He passed me without an embrace or a word. Nora watched him reach the sidewalk, then ran after him. I remained near the courthouse doors because this moment belonged to them. She stopped several feet away and asked whether he would have dinner with her. Not every week, not as a promise that they could recover her childhood, and not as proof that he had forgiven me. Just one meal where they could sit across from each other without lawyers, prison walls, or my family's version of him between them. Aaron looked at his daughter for a long time. Then he nodded once. "One dinner," he said. "No promises." 4 months after the hearing, Aaron received the court order confirming that his conviction had been vacated and the plea withdrawn. The state began correcting the records that had followed him through job applications, housing forms, background checks, and every room where someone searched his name before deciding what kind of man he was. There was no check waiting for him outside the courthouse, and no official apology that could return 11 years. Each correction required another form, another certified copy, and another explanation of why a record that should never have existed was still appearing in a database. Aaron handled most of it through Leah. He did not ask me to help, and I respected that boundary. The investigation into Colin moved more slowly. Detectives examined the entry into my house, the missing equipment, the use of my mother's spare key, and the message he sent before anyone outside the police knew what had been taken. Investigators also reviewed his private settlement proposal, the exact 14-minute window listed in its appendix, and the old hospital records. No one promised us a particular charge or sentence. Some conduct had happened 11 years earlier, and every legal question carried rules about evidence and time limits that I did not pretend to understand. What remained clear was that Colin's present actions had created a new trail. He had tried to seize evidence, control witnesses, and trade Aaron's letters for our silence long after he could claim panic or addiction had clouded one terrible night. The recovery organization removed Colin from its board and erased his name from its leadership page. Several donors suspended their support until an independent review was complete. Former clients argued publicly about whether the good he had done should matter more than the harm he caused. I did not join those arguments. Colin had helped some people rebuild their lives. That truth did not cancel what he did to Aaron. In some ways, it made his choices harder to excuse. He had spent years speaking about second chances, while denying Aaron his first chance to be believed. My mother eventually delivered 3 boxes to Leah's office. 2 contained Aaron's letters to Nora, most still sealed. The third held old family photographs, copies of court documents, and notes in Evelyn's handwriting listing which relatives should say Aaron left before the tornado warning. Her attorney said she was cooperating. Whether that cooperation would reduce any consequence was not mine to decide. The greatest change had already happened. Nora and I no longer allowed Evelyn to define family, memory, or forgiveness for us. A few relatives called Nora after the video became part of the public court record. One aunt apologized for lowering her eyes when Colin moved the chair. A cousin admitted she had believed the conviction gave her permission not to ask questions. Colin's oldest son sent a longer message, saying he was ashamed of what his father had said at the birthday dinner. Nora read each apology and answered only the ones she chose. My mother called twice. Nora did not respond. I told Evelyn that contact would happen only if Nora requested it, and that apologies could not be used as invitations back into her life. My mother accused me of turning my daughter against her. For the first time, I did not explain myself. Leah gave me the 3 boxes after cataloging them for the investigation. I drove them to Aaron's workshop on a gray Saturday morning. He met me outside beside a half-repaired boat engine, wiping grease from his hands with a cloth. The boxes filled most of my back seat. He stared at them before looking at me. "Those are all the letters?" "All the ones Evelyn returned." He opened the top box and lifted one envelope. Nora's childhood address was written across the front, followed by the year she turned 8. The stamp had never been canceled, because Evelyn had intercepted some letters through the prison family correspondence process before they were mailed onward. Others had been delivered to her house after I moved and had simply disappeared into storage. "I didn't read them," I said. "They belong to you and Nora." Aaron placed the envelope back carefully. "You could have brought them to her. I thought that decision should be yours." He studied my face as though he were waiting for the request hidden beneath the gesture. I did not ask him to forgive me, thank me, or believe that returning the letters made us even. After a moment, he nodded and began carrying the boxes inside. Before I left, he told me he had met Nora for lunch twice. The first meal had been mostly silence. During the second, she showed him photographs from school and explained how she wanted to study media preservation after graduation. He admitted that he knew almost nothing about the person she had become. "You can learn," I said. "I'm trying." That was all he offered, and it was enough. Nora and I were still repairing our own relationship. She no longer avoided me, but some questions remained between us. One evening, while we sorted copies of Aaron's letters at the kitchen table, she placed my old affidavit beside the corrected one. "I haven't forgotten this," she said, touching my first signature. "I don't expect you to." She rested her fingers on the second statement. "But I saw what you did after you knew the truth." Her words did not feel like forgiveness, and I did not turn them into more than she intended. They were an acknowledgement that the woman who signed the first statement and the woman who corrected it were both her mother. I would have to live honestly enough for her to decide which one shaped our future. Over the next several weeks, Aaron met Nora at ordinary places. They had coffee at a diner near her school, walked through a used bookstore, and visited the lake where he once taught her to throw bread to ducks. Sometimes they came home laughing. Other times Nora returned quiet because Aaron had missed a story, a teacher, or a version of her that no explanation could recreate. He never pretended those years had not happened. When Nora mentioned a childhood memory he did not share, he asked questions instead of inventing familiarity. When she became angry, he did not demand gratitude because his name had been cleared. He allowed their relationship to be awkward, which was more honest than the instant reunion both of them had been denied. Aaron and I spoke only when necessary. We discussed Nora, the legal records, and the letters. We did not discuss moving back together or finishing the divorce. The hearing had corrected a conviction, not repaired a marriage. For years, I had believed healing meant returning everything to the way it had been. Now I understood that the old arrangement was part of what failed us. I could not rebuild the home Aaron lost by asking him to step back into the same place. I could only make sure that no one inside my house was required to accept a lie for the sake of peace. Nora invited him to dinner near the end of summer. She did not plan a celebration or tell the extended family. She asked me to make chicken with rosemary potatoes because it was one of the few meals she remembered Aaron cooking before his arrest. I set 3 places at our small kitchen table and resisted the urge to make the evening look more important than it was. Aaron arrived, carrying a paper bag from a bakery. He stood just inside the doorway in a clean work shirt, his hands empty after giving me the bag. For a moment, none of us knew whether to shake hands, hug, or pretend the uncertainty was not there. Nora stepped forward and hugged him first. Aaron held her carefully, as if afraid that closing his arms too tightly might break the permission she had just given him. When they separated, I carried the food to the table. Aaron followed us into the kitchen, then stopped. There were 3 chairs, but he looked at them, as though each one belonged to a life he had not been invited to enter. One stood across from Nora. Another was near me. The third remained slightly away from the table because I had moved it earlier while sweeping. He did not ask where to sit. Nora noticed his hesitation. She reached for the chair beside her, pulled it away from the table, and turned it toward him. The wooden legs scraped softly across the floor. The sound carried me back to my mother's birthday, but everything it meant had changed. "You don't have to know how to be my dad tonight," Nora said. "Just sit with me." Aaron placed one hand on the chair. His face tightened, and he looked down until he could trust his voice. Then he sat beside his daughter. I took the seat across from them. I did not move closer, explain the moment, or ask either of them what it meant for tomorrow. Nora opened the bakery bag. Aaron complained that she had chosen the one pie he never liked, and she told him he had 11 years of missed opinions to catch up on. Their laughter was hesitant at first, then easier. We did not become a whole family again that night. We became 3 people sitting at the same table, without a lie deciding who belonged there. This time, no one moved the chair away.